When my husband died, I thought the pain of losing him was the worst thing I would ever have to endure. I thought the tears, the loneliness, and the long nights of silence were the
My
darkest
son, where
valleys I
are
would
you?
walk through. But I was wrong, because, in the days that followed, something happened that shook me deeper than death itself. It came from someone I loved more than life itself, my only son. He asked me something so unexpected, so piercing, that for a moment, I couldn't even breathe. It wasn't the kind of question you prepare for as a mother. It wasn't something you could answer with a simple yes or no. It was the kind of question that makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, your family, your identity, and the world you live in. But here's the cruel twist. Before I could even process what my son said, I realized his question wasn't born out of curiosity. It was born out of pain, a pain that had been building, quietly, secretly, beneath the surface of our lives. A pain rooted not just in the loss of his father, but in the invisible weight of something darker, something passed down through generations of people who looked like us. That night, as I sat staring into my son's eyes, my mind raced back. Through every choice we had made, every insult we had swallowed, every injustice we had endured, I realized that this wasn't just his question. It was the question of a people. It was the question of survival. And when I finally tell you what my son asked me, it may shock you too, because it is not the kind of question a child should ever have to ask his mother. But before we get there, I need to take you back to where it all began. Because only then will you understand why my son's words cut so deep, and why, to this day, they echo in my heart like a wound that refuses to close. My story begins in a small town where everyone knew each other's names, but not everyone treated each other with respect. It was a place that looked calm on the surface: quiet streets, tidy houses, children running barefoot through the grass. But beneath that surface ran an invisible current. A current that divided us, reminded us daily of where we stood in a world that pretended equality had already been achieved. My husband, Daniel, was a proud man. He worked harder than anyone I knew, not just to provide for us, but to prove, day after day, that he belonged in spaces that were never meant for him. He woke up before sunrise, worked through exhaustion, and still came home every evening with a smile, ready to wrap his arms around me and our little boy. But behind his smile, I could always see the weariness, the exhaustion that didn't come from work alone, but from the quiet humiliations he endured, being followed in stores, being spoken to like a child by men half his age, being overlooked for promotions even though he was the most qualified. He bore it all with dignity, shielding our son from the ugliness of the world. And then, one morning, he didn't wake up. They said it was his heart, that it simply gave out, but I knew better. His heart didn't just stop beating. It was broken long before, broken by the weight of carrying his family through a world that refused to see his humanity, broken by the years of pretending he wasn't tired, pretending he wasn't angry, pretending he wasn't hurt. When he died, the world felt emptier, colder. My son, barely 12 years old, clung to me like a shadow. He asked about his father, constantly, why he was gone, why good men like him had to leave so soon, why the world was so unfair. And I had no answers. We buried Daniel on a rainy afternoon, the kind of rain that feels endless, like the sky itself is grieving. Friends and neighbors came, offered condolences, brought casseroles we never touched. But when the last car left, when the last handshake faded, I stood alone in our small living room, staring at my son, realizing that life had shifted forever. It was in the silence that followed that my son changed. He stopped smiling the way he used to. He stopped asking about little things and started asking about bigger ones, the kind of questions that revealed the burden he was beginning to carry on his own shoulders. And that's when it began, the long road to the night when he asked me something that froze my blood. A question that revealed he had seen more, felt more, and understood more about this world than I ever wanted him to. But before I tell you what that question was, let me show you how we got there. After Daniel's death, our home became heavier, not in the way you notice with your eyes, but with the kind of heaviness that seeps into your chest and makes every breath an effort. The air felt different, almost as if silence itself had a weight. My son filled that silence with questions at first, but then slowly he stopped speaking as much, and that frightened me more than anything. In the first weeks, people visited often. Some brought food, others prayers, some even words of encouragement that felt empty but were well-intentioned. Yet I noticed something else, how some of the people who never bothered with us before suddenly came, speaking in hushed tones, offering sympathy laced with curiosity. I saw it in their eyes. They weren't just mourning my husband, they were studying us, measuring us. A black widow, a fatherless black boy. In their eyes, we had slipped into a statistic. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I needed to stay strong for my son. I threw myself into work, cleaning houses during the day and waitressing at night. The bills didn't pause for grief. Rent was still due, food still needed to be bought, shoes still wore out on my son's growing feet. Every dollar I earned felt like a battle won. But each night when I came home, I saw something in my son's eyes that worried me more than our bank account ever could. He had changed. At school, he was quieter. Teachers told me he seemed distracted, often staring out the window instead of paying attention. One day, when I picked him up, I noticed his backpack was torn, the strap hanging by threads. When I asked what happened, he just shrugged. Later, I learned the truth. A group of boys had cornered him behind the gym, mocking him, calling him names I will not repeat. They shoved him until he fell, then ripped his bag while laughing. I wanted to march into that school the next morning and demand answers. I wanted to scream at the teachers for not protecting my son, for letting history repeat itself in playground form. But I remembered Daniel. I remembered his words. Choose your battles wisely. They'll expect you to be angry. Don't give them the satisfaction of confirming their picture of you. So instead, I held my son close that night and told him he was stronger than anything they could throw at him. But inside, I was breaking. It didn't stop there. He started noticing things I had always tried to shield him from. When we walked into a store, he tugged at my arm and whispered, "Mama, why is that man watching us?" He noticed how, at restaurants, we sometimes got served last, even when we arrived first. He noticed how neighbors crossed the street when he and his friends played outside. And with every observation, he grew quieter. I began to fear silence more than noise, because silence meant he was thinking, and thinking meant he was adding pieces together, pieces I wished he could remain innocent to for a little longer. One night, I found him sitting at the kitchen table staring at an old photograph of his father. It was one of my favorites. Daniel holding him as a toddler, his tiny hands clutching his father's face, both of them laughing with pure joy. But my son wasn't smiling as he looked at it. His face was heavy, his eyes glistening with tears. He refused to let fall. I asked what he was thinking. He shook his head. He muttered something under his breath, so soft I almost didn't catch it. It's not fair. Not fair. The words echoed in my mind long after he went to bed. And I knew he was right. It wasn't fair. None of it was. Not his father's death. Not the cruelty of other children. Not the weight he carried on his young shoulders. As weeks turned to months, I saw him wrestling with something deep inside. He began avoiding mirrors, as if he didn't want to see his reflection. He wore hoodies even on warm days, pulling the hood over his head as though hiding himself from the world. He stopped playing basketball, a game he once loved, saying he didn't feel like it anymore. I could feel it coming, the question he hadn't yet asked. Sometimes I'd catch him opening his mouth as though to speak, only to stop and retreat into silence again. Other times he would linger near me as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. And every time, my heart sank because I knew. I knew whatever he was carrying. It wasn't small. It wasn't the kind of thing a mother could fix with a hug or a home-cooked meal. It was bigger, deeper, something that had been planted in him by a world that had already decided who he was before he even had a chance to decide for himself. Began to dread the day when he would finally put that burden into words. Because words, once spoken, can never be taken back. And I feared his words would reveal a truth too painful for me to hear. But I also knew they were coming. I could see it in his eyes. The storm was gathering. And when it broke, it would change everything. It happened on a night when the world outside seemed calm, but inside our small home, a storm was brewing. The air was thick, heavy, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting to break. I had just finished washing the dishes, my hands raw from the hot water, when I noticed my son's bedroom light still glowing under the door. It was past midnight. I knocked softly, then pushed the door open. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his shoulders hunched, his hands gripping a pillow so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes were red, not from sleep, but from tears. Tears he hadn't let me see. For a moment he didn't notice, me standing there. He was whispering to himself, his lips trembling, his body shaking like he was carrying a weight far too heavy for his young frame. When he finally looked up, his face broke me. His expression was one I had never seen before, a mix of pain, fear, and desperation. I sat beside him, placing my hand gently on his back. He flinched at first, then leaned into me like a drowning child clinging to driftwood. And then, in a voice so small it barely carried across the room, he asked it, the question that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Mama, would it be easier for me if I wasn't black? The words sliced through me like a blade. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My body froze, my mind screaming, but no sound escaped my lips. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that the world was fair, that skin was just skin. But I couldn't lie, because I knew the truth. And the truth was cruel. He buried his face in my lap, sobbing with the kind of grief no child should ever know. His small shoulders shook violently as he cried, and I sat there, my own tears falling silently into his hair. My heart shattered in ways I didn't think possible. Losing my husband had been devastating. But this was different. This was watching my son, my baby, question his own worth, question his right to exist exactly as God made him. I wanted to scream at the world that had done this to him. I wanted to fight every insult, every cruel laugh, every sideways glance that had led him here, to this night, to this question. But all I could do was hold him as if my arms alone could protect him from a world determined to make him doubt himself. Hold him as if love could erase centuries of hatred. And as I rocked him gently, whispering words of comfort that felt too small against such a big wound, I realized something. This wasn't just my son's question. It was the question of every child who has ever been made to feel less because of the color of their skin. And it was a question that demanded an answer, not just from me, but from the world. I held my son until his sobs turned into quiet sniffles, until exhaustion finally pulled him into a restless sleep. But I didn't sleep that night. I sat there in the darkness of his room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his question pressing down on me. Would it be easier if I wasn't black? The words echoed in my head like a cruel refrain, repeating over and over, burning into my chest. I thought of Daniel, My husband had carried the same unspoken question his entire life, though he never dared to say it aloud. I saw it in the way he walked into job interviews, already bracing for rejection. I saw it when he came home after being pulled over for no reason, his face calm but his hands trembling. I saw it in the quiet nights, when he sat alone at the table, staring into nothing, fighting battles I could never see but always felt. He carried it with dignity, with silence, and it cost him everything. And now, my son was carrying it, too. It broke me to realize that grief wasn't the only thing my child had inherited. He had also inherited the burden of a world that sees him as less before he even has the chance to prove himself as more. That night, I promised myself that I would not let silence swallow him the way it had swallowed his father. I would not let this question define him. He needed to know the truth. Not the sugar-coated truth, but the truth that could set him free. In the days that followed, I spoke to him more openly than I ever had before. I told him about the strength of his father, about the resilience of those who came before us, about the blood that carried not just struggle but courage, brilliance, and survival. I reminded him that his skin was not a curse but a crown, that every shade of him carried a story of triumph written by ancestors who refused to disappear. I didn't lie to him. I told him life would not always be fair, that people would sometimes judge him before they even knew him. But I told him something even more important, that he had a choice. He could let their ignorance define him, or he could rise above it, carrying his father's strength and my love with him every step of the way. And slowly, I saw the light return to his eyes. Not all at once, not like magic, but like dawn, breaking after a long night. There were still hard days, days when he came home quiet, days when the world tried to press him back down. But there were also victories. Small victories like the time he stood tall during a class presentation, even though he knew some were waiting for him to stumble. Or the day he joined his friends on the basketball court again, his laughter ringing out like music I thought I'd never hear again. Through it all, I realized something. My son's question was never truly about whether life would be easier if he wasn't black. Deep down, he already knew the answer to that. His question was really about whether life was worth fighting for as he was. And my answer, every single day, will always be yes. Yes, it will be hard. Yes, the world will sometimes be cruel. But yes, his life matters. His identity matters. His existence, exactly as God made him, matters. And if the world cannot see that, then it is the world that must change. So tonight, I want to leave you with the same question my son asked me, because it is not just his burden, nor mine. It is ours. If a child has to ask his mother whether his life would be easier if he wasn't born the way he is, what does that say about the world we've built? And more importantly, what are we willing to do to change it? This video uses AI-generated voiceover for narration. The story is a work of creative storytelling, inspired by real-life themes, but adapted for educational and awareness purposes. No copyrighted material has been used. This content follows YouTube's policies on AI-generated media, sensitive topics, and community guidelines.